The territorial expansion of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania during the 13th and 14th centuries created a massive geopolitical entity that spanned from the Baltic Sea to the shores of the Black Sea. This rapid growth necessitated the development of complex administrative systems to govern a diverse population of pagan, Orthodox, and eventually Catholic subjects. During the reign of the early dukes, the state operated as a decentralized military confederation, relying on the conquest of Slavic principalities to secure resources and manpower. The integration of these vast eastern territories required the establishment of permanent urban centers to serve as nodes for taxation and governance. Unlike the feudal monarchies of Western Europe, the Lithuanian state maintained a unique structure where the central authority possessed direct ownership of specific social groups to fulfill economic voids. The transition from a nomadic military society to a settled European power forced the ruling dynasty to implement standardized legal codes and fiscal policies. By the mid-14th century, the Grand Duchy had become the largest state on the continent, yet it lacked the native merchant class necessary to facilitate international trade and currency circulation. This institutional deficit led to the adoption of specific immigration policies designed to attract external expertise in finance and artisan crafts. The state's expansionist goals were consistently balanced against the need for internal stability and the management of regional interests. These foundational political requirements established the specific juridical environment where minority populations were governed by royal prerogative rather than local customary law. The historical trajectory of the duchy was defined by its ability to synthesize various legal traditions while maintaining the supreme authority of the sovereign over all fiscal matters. This administrative legacy provided the structural basis for the eventual centralization of power that would dictate the terms of residency for all non-Christian subjects in the centuries that followed. The formal initiation of organized settlement in the Grand Duchy was a byproduct of the strategic diplomatic initiatives undertaken by Grand Duke Gediminas during the 1320s. Following the consolidation of internal power, the sovereign recognized that the continued security of his northern borders depended upon the rapid modernization of his urban infrastructure. In 1323, Gediminas issued a series of circular letters addressed to the cities of the Hanseatic League and the administrative centers of the Holy Roman Empire. These communications were not merely pleas for migration, but were sophisticated diplomatic instruments intended to bypass the commercial blockade imposed by the Teutonic Order. The letters specifically targeted individuals proficient in international commerce, metalworking, and financial management, offering them substantial incentives to relocate to the new capital of Vilnius. The monarch promised that all newcomers would be exempt from the traditional taxes imposed on the native peasantry for a specified period of years. Furthermore, the letters established the principle of legal pluralism, guaranteeing that foreign professionals could adjudicate their internal disputes according to their own communal customs. This policy of deliberate recruitment was designed to create a buffer of skilled intermediaries who could link the agrarian resources of the interior with the lucrative markets of the Baltic. The influx of these specialists provided the necessary technical expertise to mint currency and manage the royal mints, which were essential for the transition to a monetary economy. Gediminas' foresight established the Grand Duchy as a competitive participant in European trade routes, effectively ending its commercial isolation. By securing these populations under royal safe conduct, the Grand Duke asserted his independence from neighboring ecclesiastical authorities who sought to control the movement of artisans. This recruitment strategy ensured that the nascent urban centers possessed the demographic diversity and professional specialization required to support the expanding needs of the central government and the military elite. The demographic influx that followed the diplomatic openings of the early 14th century was characterized by the movement of organized communities from the central and eastern regions of the Holy Roman Empire. These migrants traveled primarily along the overland trade routes, passing through Mazovia and the northern territories of the Kingdom of Poland, establishing a continuous link between the Germanic urban centers and the Lithuanian interior. Upon their entry into the Grand Duchy, These groups were not integrated into the existing agrarian social order, but were instead classified as a distinct legal category. This classification granted them a status separate from the native peasantry and the lower military orders, placing them under the direct protection of the central treasury. The arrival of these populations introduced a systematic approach to large-scale commerce that relied on pre-existing familial and professional associations spanning several European states. These networks allowed for the rapid movement of capital and the procurement of luxury goods, metals, and textiles that were otherwise unavailable in the Baltic region. The settlers functioned as a specialized cohort whose primary obligation was to enhance the fiscal liquidity of the sovereign's court through tax farming and the management of regional customs points. This role ensured that the central government could access reliable revenue streams independent of the volatile contributions provided by the regional nobility. The economic integration of these groups was facilitated by their mastery of bookkeeping and contract law, which provided a stable framework for conducting high-value transactions. Their presence allowed the Grand Duchy to formalize its internal markets, establishing standardized weights and measures that aligned with international commercial norms. By operating as direct agents of the monarch, this cohort secured the political and economic interests of the dynasty, providing the necessary administrative infrastructure to support a centralized state apparatus during a period of intense territorial consolidation. But why did it all end with the expulsion of all Jews? And did they actually deserve it? The formalization of the legal framework governing Jewish residency was achieved through the issuance of the fundamental charters by Grand Duke Vytautas in 1388. These documents represented a significant shift from informal royal protection to a codified system of rights that defined the community as a specific protected class within the Grand Duchy. The charters established that Jewish subjects were exempt from the jurisdiction of municipal and provincial courts, answering only to the sovereign or his designated representatives. This judicial insulation was a critical component of state policy, ensuring that the community's assets remained accessible to the central treasury without interference from the local nobility. Furthermore, the legislation explicitly granted the right to internal self-governance, allowing for the creation of independent tribunals to manage religious and civil disputes within the community. These internal courts operated based on traditional legal precedents, providing a level of cultural and administrative autonomy that was rare in contemporary Europe. The charters also included specific provisions for religious freedom, protecting synagogues and burial grounds from desecration, and guaranteeing the right to observe traditional rites without state interference. Economically, the decree reaffirmed the right to own real estate and engage in diverse commercial activities, including the lending of capital and the trade of essential commodities. By anchoring these privileges in written law, Vytautas secured the long-term presence of a group whose fiscal contributions were vital for his ambitious military and political reforms. This legal stabilization fostered a sense of security that encouraged further demographic growth and the development of permanent communal institutions across the urban centers of the realm. The 1388 charters remained the primary legal reference for centuries, serving as the foundational contract between the monarchy and its Jewish subjects until the totalizing policy shifts of the late 15th century. The specific juridical status of the Jewish community within the Grand Duchy was defined by the adaptation of the servants of the treasury designation, a fiscal mechanism that mirrored the administrative structures of Central European monarchies. This classification established a direct and exclusive legal bond between the minority population and the personal office of the Grand Duke, effectively placing their persons and property outside the standard feudal hierarchy. Under this system, the community was viewed as a vital financial asset of the state, serving as a specialized reservoir of liquid capital that the sovereign could access through various extraordinary levies. This relationship was managed by the court treasury, which utilized the community's financial expertise to bridge the gap between agrarian tax cycles and the immediate needs of the central government. The status ensured that the community was protected from the legislative interference of the regional diets and the growing influence of the landed nobility, who sought to restrict royal fiscal autonomy. In practice, being a servant of the Treasury meant that every commercial transaction and credit agreement was ultimately subject to royal oversight and potential appropriation. This centralized control allowed the Grand Duke to utilize Jewish capital as a strategic tool for funding state-building initiatives and securing mercenary military support. The community's assets were often used as collateral for international loans or to facilitate the procurement of essential war materiel. While providing a necessary layer of physical security, this designation reinforced the community's political vulnerability, as their continued residence was predicated entirely on their ability to meet the escalating financial demands of the crown. The fiscal integration into the court's internal accounts created a unique administrative category where religious identity was secondary to economic utility. This arrangement successfully insulated the monarchy's primary creditors from local judicial reach, while ensuring that the totality of their wealth remained at the disposal of the sovereign. The integration of Jewish credit into the Grand Duchy's internal economy provided the essential financial infrastructure for the execution of large-scale state projects. During the late 14th and 15th centuries, the monarchy utilized sophisticated lending mechanisms to fund the construction of massive defensive fortifications and royal residences. These projects required the immediate procurement of materials and the payment of skilled labor, costs that could not be covered by the traditional, slow-moving agricultural tribute. Financial specialists facilitated these undertakings by advancing significant sums against future tax revenues, allowing the state to maintain a permanent workforce for the expansion of urban defenses. Beyond military architecture, this capital underpinned the development of major ecclesiastical buildings and administrative centers, enabling the dynasty to project an image of permanence and authority across its territories. The involvement of these financiers was catalytic in the growth of the regional wool and grain trades, as they provided the necessary startup capital for merchant guilds to participate in long-distance exchange. By underwriting the risks associated with international maritime and overland transit, they ensured a steady supply of silver and luxury goods to the ducal court. The sophisticated use of promissory notes and credit transfers allowed for the movement of wealth across borders without the physical transportation of bullion, a capability that was paramount for the sovereign's diplomatic activities. This role as an economic intermediary allowed for the transition from a barter-based system to a standardized market economy governed by documented contracts. The financing extended to the management of royal estates, where advanced accounting techniques were applied to increase productivity and ensure consistent yields for the central government. Consequently, the specialized knowledge of credit served as the primary driver for the material development of the realm, making the community a fundamental component of the duchy's structural transformation into a modern European state. The internal administrative cohesion of the Jewish population was managed through the establishment of the self-governing council, known as the Kahal. This institution functioned as the primary link between the individual household and the central government, exercising comprehensive authority over the civic and social life of the urban districts. The council members were typically drawn from the intellectual and commercial elite, ensuring that the community was represented by individuals possessing the necessary literacy and legal training to navigate royal bureaucracy. One of the principal functions of the Kahal was the distribution and collection of collective taxes, a system where the state assigned a lump sum to the entire community, leaving the council to determine individual assessments based on internal wealth and property. This mechanism ensured a predictable revenue stream for the sovereign, while allowing the community to manage its own fiscal redistribution. Beyond finance, the council supervised the educational infrastructure, maintaining a network of primary and advanced schools that ensured high rates of theological and legal literacy among the male population. This commitment to scholarship served as a primary anchor for cultural preservation in a diverse geopolitical environment. The judicial arm of the Kahal, composed of local rabbinic authorities, provided a forum for resolving internal civil disputes, which prevented the influx of community issues into the state court system. These councils also managed social welfare programs, including the administration of communal hospitals, cemeteries, and provisions for the impoverished. By centralizing these services, the Kahal fostered a high degree of social stability and internal discipline, which was essential for maintaining the community's professional reputation. This structure effectively functioned as an autonomous administrative layer, providing the state with a manageable and organized subject group, while allowing the minority to preserve its distinct social fabric through generations of territorial and political change. The signing of the Union of Kreuo in 1385 initiated a fundamental transformation of the Grand Duchy's social and legal landscape by aligning its political interests with the Kingdom of Poland. This dynastic alliance necessitated the official adoption of Western Christianity, marking the end of the state's pagan era and the beginning of a systematic religious consolidation. As the ruling elite and the broader population underwent conversion, the previous social equilibrium, which had accommodated a variety of belief systems, was replaced by a rigid theological hierarchy. This shift significantly altered the standing of the Jewish community, as they emerged as the only substantial non-Christian group within an increasingly monolithic religious environment. The newly established Catholic administrative structures began to exert influence over royal legislation, seeking to harmonize the duchy's laws with the exclusionary practices prevalent in the Polish realm. Consequently, the legal protections that had once been based on pragmatic economic utility were now scrutinized through a lens of religious conformity. The political union also brought an influx of Western European clerics who introduced more stringent interpretations of canon law regarding the interaction between believers and non-believers. These developments contributed to a gradual social isolation as the state began to prioritize the interests of the newly converted nobility and the expanding church institutions. The integration of the duchy into the Western Latin world effectively removed the religious buffer provided by the former pagan plurality, leaving the Jewish population increasingly visible and vulnerable to doctrinal shifts. While the sovereign still recognized the community's fiscal importance, the ideological pressure for a unified Christian state created the first significant cracks in the historical contract between the monarch and his subjects. This period established the legislative precedent for treating religious difference as a potential risk to the internal security and spiritual integrity of the dual monarchy. The institutionalization of the Catholic faith as the primary state religion led to the systematic implementation of ecclesiastical policies aimed at the social and physical isolation of the Jewish population. During the 15th century, the church hierarchy within the Grand Duchy began to formalize a doctrine of segregation, asserting that the proximity of non-believers posed a substantial threat to the spiritual purity of the newly baptized Christian populace. This ideological shift resulted in the periodic issuance of diocesan decrees that restricted the ability of Jewish subjects to reside in areas directly adjacent to cathedrals or major monastic complexes. The ecclesiastical courts sought to expand their influence by advocating for the enforcement of the distinctive dress requirements and the prohibition of social interactions between the two groups. These measures were designed to create a visible and permanent barrier, reinforcing the subordinate status of the minority within the urban social fabric. The Church also prioritized the elimination of Jewish influence over the domestic sphere, specifically targeting the employment of Christian laborers or servants in Jewish households as a violation of religious protocol. Furthermore, the local clergy began to exert pressure on municipal governments to limit the physical expansion of synagogues, arguing that these structures should not exceed the height or visual prominence of Christian places of worship. This regulatory environment was supported by the circulation of theological literature that framed the community as an inherent source of spiritual contamination. While the Grand Dukes occasionally resisted these demands to preserve their fiscal interests, the cumulative effect of this constant ecclesiastical advocacy was the gradual erosion of the legal standing of the minority. By the mid-15th century, the principle of mandatory separation had become a standard component of provincial administrative discourse, providing the ideological foundation for the more comprehensive exclusionary measures that would materialize during the reign of Alexander Jagiellon. The arrival of the preaching orders, specifically the Dominicans and the Franciscans, introduced a more aggressive form of religious advocacy into the Grand Duchy during the 15th century. These mendicant friars operated independently of the established parish clergy, focusing their efforts on urban centers where they could reach large segments of the non-elite population. Their methodology relied on the delivery of public sermons in open spaces, utilizing persuasive techniques to disseminate a specific theological vision of a unified Christian state. These exhortations were frequently designed to frame the Jewish minority as a persistent ideological threat, accusing them of undermining the social and moral order through their commercial and financial activities. By redirecting localized economic grievances into a religious framework, the friars successfully mobilized popular resentment against the community's professional success. This spiritual campaign included the public reading of anti-Jewish literature and the promotion of narratives that characterized the community as inherently hostile to the Christian faith. The mendicant influence extended into the royal court, where friars often served as advisors or confessors, pressuring the monarchy to adopt more stringent exclusionary policies. Their presence ensured that religious intolerance was not merely a matter of elite discourse, but became a widely shared sentiment among the artisan and merchant classes. The friars also advocated for the conversion of the minority, utilizing both psychological pressure and the promise of social advancement to encourage the abandonment of traditional rites. These activities created a climate of constant ideological tension, significantly complicating the community's efforts to maintain its legally protected status. By transforming abstract theological disagreements into tangible social animosity, the mendicant orders provided the necessary social mobilization for the later state-sponsored removal. Their sustained efforts throughout the century ensured that by the time of the 1495 decree, the concept of total exclusion had gained substantial support across various levels of Lithuanian society. The reign of Casimir IV or Jagiellon, spanning the latter half of the 15th century, was characterized by the maintenance of a sophisticated administrative equilibrium between the crown's fiscal requirements and the escalating demands of the political estates. As both Grand Duke of Lithuania and King of Poland, Casimir utilized the Jewish population as a stabilized financial instrument to fund the complex needs of his dual monarchy. In 1447 and again in 1453, the sovereign issued formal confirmations of the ancient charters, reinforcing the community's specific legal protections against the judicial overreach of the regional nobility. These renewals were not merely traditional gestures, but were calculated responses to the sovereign's need for a reliable professional class capable of managing the royal domains and the extraction of salt and mineral resources. The monarch's reliance on this group was necessitated by the structural weakness of the state's internal banking systems and the intermittent nature of feudal military levies. Casimir's policy ensured that Jewish administrators held key positions within the central tax-collecting apparatus, where they provided the immediate liquidity required for diplomatic missions and the maintenance of royal garrisons. This proximity to the throne allowed the community to function with a level of security that contrasted with a rising intolerance in neighboring Central European territories. However, this protection was strictly transactional. The sovereign exacted substantial extraordinary payments in exchange for his continued intervention in local disputes. The monarch's refusal to yield to ecclesiastical pressure for total segregation was rooted in the pragmatic assessment that the removal of these financial agents would cause an immediate collapse of the royal budget. By centralizing the management of these subjects under the personal authority of the Grand Ducal Court, Casimir successfully insulated the state's primary creditors from the legislative hostility of the growing parliament. This period represented the final era of stability for the community, where royal prerogatives still superseded the collective interests of the landed aristocracy and the urban guilds. The fiscal integration achieved during this reign established the very economic conditions that would eventually become the primary cause for political friction under Casimir's successors. The socio-political ascent of the landed nobility during the 15th century introduced a structural conflict between the traditional feudal elite and the specialized administrative class favored by the monarchy. As the aristocracy consolidated its local power, it began to perceive the exclusive financial alliance between the sovereign and the Jewish minority as a direct obstruction to its own institutional growth. This friction was primarily rooted in the competition for control over the Grand Duchy's internal revenue sources, specifically the leasing of royal monopolies. The nobility resented the concentration of fiscal offices, such as the management of the alcohol trade and the oversight of salt mines, in the hands of individuals who operated outside the feudal hierarchy. By securing these high-value leases, Jewish administrators effectively prevented the landed elite from accessing the liquid wealth necessary to maintain their political standing. Furthermore, the aristocracy viewed the direct legal dependence of the minority on the Grand Duke as a violation of the emerging parliamentary spirit, which sought to decentralize judicial authority. The nobility argued that the presence of royal agents who were exempt from local manorial oversight undermined the stability of the feudal estate system. This resentment extended to the urban sector, where the landed class sought to restrict Jewish involvement in long-distance wholesale trade to favor the economic interests of their own clients. The legislative assemblies of the period became a venue for the nobility to petition for the repeal of commercial freedoms that had been granted to non-Christians by previous dynasties. This organized opposition was not motivated by theological disagreement alone, but by a strategic desire to seize the administrative apparatus of the state. The nobility's efforts to dismantle the existing fiscal framework represented a fundamental challenge to royal prerogative, creating a permanent political divide that would dictate the future of Lithuanian internal policy. The administrative efficiency of the Grand Duchy during the 15th century relied heavily on the system of tax farming, which allowed the central treasury to secure predictable revenue through the leasing of collection rights. Under this arrangement, Jewish financiers paid a fixed sum to the crown in advance, assuming the legal and logistical burden of extracting various state imposts from the general population. These duties encompassed a wide range of civic and commercial activities, including the collection of bridge tolls, mill fees, and tavern licenses, as well as the customs duties imposed on imported commodities at the border. The structural necessity for the leaseholder to maximize returns created a direct and constant friction with the burghers and the rural peasantry, who viewed these collections as a personal and arbitrary burden. Because the leaseholders functioned as the visible faces of royal fiscal policy, they became the primary targets for communal grievances that would otherwise have been directed at the sovereign. This intermediary role served as a political buffer for the monarchy, allowing the court to distance itself from the unpopular mechanics of capital extraction while maintaining its financial solvency. The localized hostility was exacerbated by the state's requirement that these collections be strictly enforced by the Grand Ducal bailiffs, linking the Jewish agents directly to the coercive power of the central government. For the general populace, the tax farmer represented the most immediate and intrusive manifestation of state authority in their daily economic lives. The management of these leases required a high degree of literacy and the ability to organize regional networks of sub-collectors, skills that were concentrated within the protected minority. This systemic tension transformed professional activities into a source of chronic social volatility, particularly as urban guilds sought to regain control over local markets. By the late 15th century, the reliance on these intermediaries had created a permanent climate of distrust, ensuring that any period of economic hardship resulted in immediate pressure for the removal of the crown's fiscal agents. The middle of the 15th century witnessed the institutionalization of specific slanderous myths that fundamentally altered the judicial safety of minority communities across Central Europe. In 1453, the city of Breslau became the epicenter of a major legal trial predicated on the accusation of ritual murder and the desecration of the host. This event was orchestrated by specialized inquisitorial figures who utilized coerced testimonies to secure the capital conviction of dozens of individuals. The resulting public executions and the subsequent total banishment of the local population established a lethal legal precedent that disseminated rapidly into neighboring provinces. These narratives were not contained by political borders, but traveled through established scholarly and commercial corridors, eventually reaching the urban centers of the Grand Duchy. The myth of ritual murder transformed traditional religious friction into a perceived existential threat to the physical safety of Christian children. This shift allowed municipal authorities to bypass established royal protections by framing the minority population as a secret and murderous conspiracy. The documentation of these trials was circulated through handwritten and early printed tracts, providing local magistrates with a standardized template for investigating similar charges. This ideological environment created a climate of permanent suspicion, where accidental deaths or unsolved disappearances were immediately attributed to a coordinated ethnic plot. The spread of these fabrications effectively undermined the historical contract of residence, as the common populace began to view their neighbors through the lens of a manufactured religious crusade. By the time these ideas reached the Lithuanian courts, they had been reinforced by decades of judicial successes in the Holy Roman Empire. This psychological preparation of the social ground was essential for the comprehensive state-level measures that would materialize at the end of the century, as it provided a moral justification for the termination of long-standing communal rights. The passing of the monarch Casimir IV in mid-1492 initiated a significant rupture in the governing structure of the Jagiellonian realms. This transition resulted in the deliberate partitioning of the personal union that had previously linked the Grand Duchy of Lithuania with the Kingdom of Poland. Following the sovereign's death, the two political entities pursued independent paths, with the Polish crown being conferred upon John Albert and the Lithuanian ducal authority falling to Alexander. This separation ended decades of centralized diplomatic and military coordination, leaving the Grand Duchy to manage its expansive and porous borders in isolation. The administrative split necessitated the creation of an independent Lithuanian treasury, which could no longer benefit from the integrated fiscal systems of the Polish state. This period of political disunity coincided with an era of increasing military pressure from the expanding Muscovite state to the east. Alexander's government was immediately tasked with the logistical challenge of fortifying a frontier that spanned hundreds of miles with limited indigenous resources. The division of the dynasty also empowered the local Council of Lords in Vilnius to demand greater concessions in exchange for funding the defense of the realm. These domestic political shifts occurred at a moment when the central authority was at its most vulnerable, lacking both the prestige of the late king and the military synergy of a unified kingdom. The fracturing of the administrative union highlighted the immense cost of maintaining a permanent defense force without a stable, long-term credit base. The sovereign was compelled to establish a distinct governmental apparatus that prioritized regional security over the expansive dynastic goals pursued by his predecessors. This geopolitical fragmentation created the specific internal pressures that would eventually force the Grand Ducal Court to re-evaluate its relationship with its primary financial intermediaries. The financial administration of the Grand Duchy under Alexander Jagiellon was defined by a chronic lack of liquid assets and a mounting deficit inherited from the previous decade of territorial overextension. Upon his elevation to the ducal throne, the sovereign was immediately confronted with the staggering costs of modernizing the state's military capabilities to meet the requirements of defensive warfare. The transition from traditional feudal mobilization to the employment of professional mercenary units necessitated a continuous and substantial flow of silver to the central treasury. These professional soldiers demanded regular payments in coin, a requirement that the duchy's agrarian-based revenue system struggled to fulfill. The logistical burden was further increased by the systematic reconstruction of border outposts along the Dnieper and Oka rivers, which were essential for checking the incursions from the eastern principalities. The state's fiscal records from the early 1490s indicate that the cost of maintaining these garrisons and procuring gunpowder and heavy artillery consumed nearly the entire annual income of the royal domains. Simultaneously, the southern frontier required constant subsidies to pacify the mobile cavalry forces of the Crimean Khanate, whose raids threatened the productivity of the duchy's southern grain belts. Alexander's reliance on short-term high-interest loans from domestic creditors became a permanent feature of his governance, as he lacked the political authority to levy direct taxes on the landed elite. By 1494, the total indebtedness of the crown reached a critical threshold, where the interest payments alone began to exceed the available cash reserves. This insolvency was compounded by the disruption of traditional trade routes, which reduced the income derived from international customs. The sovereign's inability to liquidate these mounting obligations forced a radical reevaluation of the state's fiscal priorities. The financial desperation of the court created an environment where the seizure of private assets appeared to be the only viable method for restoring the solvency of the central government. The geopolitical pressure on the eastern frontier reached an unprecedented level during the final decade of the 15th century as the Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan III, initiated the systematic gathering of Slavic lands. This Muscovite expansion was built upon the previous annexations of several northern principalities, which provided the Moscow court with a strategic depth to challenge the existing regional order. In 1492, Muscovite forces launched a series of incursions into the border territories, specifically targeting the upper regions of the eastern river systems and the vital fortress of Vyazma. These military actions were supported by a sophisticated ideological campaign where the Muscovite leadership claimed the right to protect all Orthodox subjects residing within the Grand Duchy. This religious claim fundamentally threatened the internal cohesion of the state, as several eastern regional lords began to defect toward the rising power in the east. The resulting conflict from 1492 to 1494 exposed the structural difficulties of defending a vast perimeter against a centralized adversary. The war concluded with a peace treaty in 1494, which forced the duchy to recognize the loss of several key border towns and significant provinces. To stabilize the frontier, a dynastic marriage was arranged between Alexander and the daughter of the Muscovite ruler, intended to act as a diplomatic safeguard. However, this union created further internal tension, as the religious authorities remained suspicious of the influence of an Eastern princess within the court. The constant threat of renewed invasion necessitated a new level of internal political consolidation, forcing the crown to seek greater unity with the regional elites to maintain the defensive lines. This external pressure acted as a primary driver for the central government to prioritize the recovery of its financial solvency by any means necessary to preserve the state's territorial integrity. The legislative transition within the Grand Duchy during the 1490s empowered the regional nobility to exert unprecedented control over the sovereign's domestic policy. This shift was formalized through the sessions of the General Assembly, where the provincial estates held the exclusive authority to authorize the extraordinary subsidies necessary for the state's survival. The central government found itself in a position where the traditional revenues from the royal domains were no longer sufficient to meet the escalating costs of professionalized military defense. To secure the required funds, the Grand Duke was compelled to enter into direct negotiations with the Council of Lords and the wider gentry, who utilized the monarch's insolvency to advance a specific political agenda. The nobility argued that the crown's reliance on non-Christian financial agents undermined the economic stability of the landed estates and the privileges of the Christian merchant class. They presented the removal of these fiscal intermediaries as a non-negotiable condition for the approval of new land taxes and military levies. This political maneuver effectively transformed a fiscal crisis into a tool for social engineering, as the estates sought to reclaim the administrative offices and commercial monopolies previously held by royal appointees. The petition for expulsion was framed as a restorative measure intended to align the duchy's internal economy with the interests of the native Catholic elite. By controlling the access to liquid capital, the nobility forced a fundamental change in the monarch's governing strategy. requiring him to prioritize the political demands of the assembly over the established financial utility of the minority population. The sovereign's consent to these demands represented a calculated sacrifice of a long-term fiscal asset in exchange for the immediate, vital support of the military estates. This legislative bargain demonstrated that the era of absolute royal prerogative in financial matters had concluded, replaced by a system where the residency rights of minority groups were subject to the consent of the dominant political class. The issuance of the Spanish expulsion decree in early 1492 acted as a transformative model for the courts of Eastern Europe, demonstrating that the total termination of long-standing minority protections could be executed as a supreme act of state-building. This precedent proved that a centralized monarchy could successfully prioritize ideological homogeneity over the immediate economic advantages provided by specialized financial groups. In the eyes of the Lithuanian administration, the Spanish example served as an authoritative blueprint for resolving internal social friction through a single, comprehensive legal command. The political news of the mass removal was disseminated through the diplomatic and scholarly networks linking the various branches of the Jagiellonian dynasty with the wider European community, providing a clear demonstration of the fusion between secular sovereignty and ecclesiastical mandate. This event signaled a broader European shift away from the medieval reliance on diverse fiscal intermediaries and toward a model of the state defined by monolithic religious uniformity. The Spanish sovereigns had successfully argued that the presence of non-Christian subjects was a source of persistent social instability that justified the total forfeiture of accumulated tax revenue. For the Lithuanian Grand Duke, this established the legitimacy of using administrative force to consolidate domestic power under a unified banner. The success of the Spanish policy in securing the absolute loyalty of the native aristocracy provided a compelling strategic rationale for duplicating such measures within the Grand Duchy. Furthermore, the precedent emphasized that the revocation of ancient privileges was a valid exercise of royal justice when framed as a measure for the spiritual defense of the realm. This international development effectively normalized the concept of mass expulsion as a standardized tool of modern statecraft, allowing the Lithuanian court to view its own internal policy changes, not as a radical departure, but as an alignment with the evolving standards of Western political authority. The strategic adoption of this model underscored the transition from a pluralistic governance tradition to a centralized regime, focused on the absolute integration of church and state interests. The administrative meetings held at the capital city of Vilnius during the spring of 1495 finalized the structural transition of the Grand Duchy from a pluralistic fiscal state to a religiously centralized regime. These deliberations were conducted within the Council of Lords, a powerful advisory body where the high-ranking clergy began to exercise an unprecedented level of influence over the sovereign's executive decisions. The primary point of contention involved the immediate fiscal consequences of terminating the legal status of the state's principal financial intermediaries versus the perceived spiritual benefits of total religious singleness. While the professional administrative staff cautioned against the disruption of the internal credit system, the religious leaders on the council argued that the Grand Duke's primary obligation was to safeguard the Catholic integrity of his territories. This clerical faction presented the removal of the non-Christian population as a necessary act of national purification that would secure divine assistance for the ongoing Eastern military campaigns. The sovereign's personal advisors and confessors played a critical role in this shift, emphasizing that the material wealth derived from non-believers was a corrupting influence on the Christian court. Consequently, the pragmatic economic traditions that had sustained the previous administration were systematically rejected in favor of a policy that aligned with the exclusionary standards of the broader Western Latin world. The council ultimately concluded that the political necessity of satisfying the nobility and the church outweighed the predictable loss of tax revenue and administrative expertise. This decision represented a formal pivot in the governance of the duchy, where the authority of the spiritual lords effectively superseded the practical requirements of the central treasury. By prioritizing theological conformity over administrative stability, the court at Vilnius dismantled the centuries-old contractual bond between the monarch and his subjects, establishing a new legal reality where residency was contingent upon adherence to the official state faith. The rhetoric of the purified nation emerged as the primary ideological justification for the termination of minority residency rights in 1495. This narrative posited that the Grand Duchy's survival depended on the absolute synchronization of political sovereignty with a single religious identity. The state apparatus began to propagate the belief that the presence of non-Catholic subjects was a spiritual impediment that actively obstructed the success of the sovereign's defensive efforts. By framing the expulsion as a religious necessity, the administration successfully redirected public attention away from the Crown's insolvency toward a collective mission of national preservation. This ideological framework transformed the Grand Duke into a figure responsible for the spiritual well-being of his subjects rather than just their secular protector. The discourse argued that any material wealth generated by non-believers was inherently tainted, and that its rejection would be rewarded with military triumph against Eastern rivals. This logic was disseminated through official proclamations that prioritized the moral integrity of the Commonwealth over its commercial stability. The narrative served to unify the disparate military estates by providing a common religious purpose that transcended regional political interests. Furthermore, the state asserted that the integration of the duchy into the community of Western Christian nations required the total removal of those who did not share the official faith. This messaging effectively delegitimized the historical contributions of minority groups, portraying them as a latent danger to the internal order. The adoption of the purified nation concept marked the final abandonment of the duchy's inclusive pagan heritage in favor of a rigid state-enforced orthodoxy. By centering the state's legitimacy on religious singleness, the court established a standard for citizenship that relied on baptismal status rather than professional utility or traditional charters. This rhetorical shift provided the essential public justification for the revocation of residence, making the totalizing policy of 1495 appear as a virtuous fulfillment of a divine mandate for state survival. The formal signing of the expulsion decree in the spring of 1495 marked the technical conclusion of the minority's legal existence within the Grand Duchy. This document was produced by the Royal Office as a definitive sovereign act that revoked all previous certifications of residency and commercial rights. The text of the instrument was meticulously constructed to emphasize that the group's continued presence was incompatible with the current requirements of the state. By applying the royal seal to this decree, the monarch exercised his supreme authority to cancel the historical contracts that had protected the minority since the 14th century. The decree provided a systematic framework for the termination of all professional activities, including the immediate suspension of any pending legal cases involving non-Christian litigants. This legislation was not a response to specific criminal acts, but was presented as an essential administrative reorganization of the realm's demographic structure. The document included a precise timeline for the evacuation, requiring that all affected individuals vacate every province and district by a specified date. To ensure absolute compliance, the Royal Office organized a network of couriers to distribute copies of the text to every provincial administrator and municipal bailiff throughout the territory. This widespread dissemination ensured that the policy was recognized as a unified national command rather than a localized measure. The decree also contained specific clauses that clarified the state's total ownership of all residual assets and communal infrastructure left behind after the departure. By drafting this instrument as a final and non-negotiable resolution, the central government eliminated any possibility of administrative appeal or regional resistance. The issuance of the text signaled that the traditional era of protected pluralism had been replaced by a rigid system of state-enforced religious homogeneity, where the law served as the primary tool for the systematic removal of an entire social category. The internal logic of the 1495 edict was centered on the concept of the state as a biological and spiritual entity that required active protection from internal corruption. This legal framework moved beyond simple religious disagreement, characterizing the presence of the minority as a contagious element capable of undermining the conviction of the Christian majority. The decree explicitly argued that the removal was a prophylactic necessity intended to insulate the newly established Catholic order from any ideological or social competition. This totaling logic redefined the community not as a group of subjects with specific rights, but as a source of spiritual perversion that threatened the collective salvation of the realm. The state asserted that even marginal interactions could lead to the gradual erosion of the faith among the uneducated classes, necessitating a complete physical separation to ensure public safety. This preventive approach transformed the central administration into a guardian of public morality, where the health of the body politic was measured by its religious uniformity. The legislation assumed that the mere existence of a different belief system within the same urban space was a persistent temptation that could lure the faithful away from the church. By framing the expulsion as a measure of spiritual hygiene, the government justified the summary cancellation of all previous legal contracts and residence permits. This shift in legal theory established the precedent that the state possessed the authority to purge any segment of the population deemed an obstacle to the spiritual unity of the nation. The decree served to finalize the transition of the Grand Duchy into a defensive fortress of the faith, where the exclusion of non-believers was seen as the only viable method to prevent the internal decay of the social order. Consequently, the act of removal was presented as a virtuous defense of the common good, ensuring that the religious foundations of the state remained unchallenged by any external influence. The execution of the 1495 edict was accompanied by a series of crippling financial strictures designed to prevent the flight of liquid capital from the Grand Duchy. As the affected population prepared for their departure, the central administration implemented rigorous controls at every major transport hub and border crossing to enforce a total prohibition on the export of gold, silver, and coined money. These regulations required all departing subjects to submit to invasive searches by royal customs officials, who were authorized to seize any precious metals found in their possession. The state's objective was to ensure that while the people were removed, the metallic wealth of the realm remained within the domestic economy to support the sovereign's military expenditures. This policy forced the community to attempt the rapid conversion of their liquid assets into bulky, less transportable commodities, such as furs, wax, or textiles, which were subject to high export duties. The immediate result was a massive devaluation of their purchasing power, as local buyers exploited the desperation of those forced to liquidate their holdings under a strict deadline. Furthermore, the decree invalidated the use of international bills of exchange for those being expelled, effectively trapping their wealth within the borders of the state they were being forced to leave. Any attempt to hide or smuggle currency was classified as a capital offense, leading to the immediate forfeiture of all remaining property to the crown. These financial barriers ensured that the exiles entered neighboring territories in a state of sudden and profound poverty, stripped of the resources they had accumulated through generations of commercial activity. By decoupling the movement of people from the movement of capital, the Grand Duke successfully monetized the expulsion, turning a demographic removal into a massive windfall for the state's depleted treasury. This systematic stripping of assets represented the final economic stage of the expulsion, ensuring that the community was not only physically removed, but also financially dismantled before they reached the frontier. The sudden invalidation of residency rights in 1495 triggered a rapid and total destabilization of the real estate market within the Grand Duchy's urban centers. All immovable assets, including stone residences, commercial warehouses, and agricultural plots, were immediately subjected to forced liquidation. Because the entire community was required to depart simultaneously, the supply of available property far exceeded the number of potential Christian buyers, resulting in a precipitous drop in valuations. Many properties were traded for a small percentage of their actual assessment, as owners sought any amount of liquid resources for their impending transit. For those unable to secure a private sale before the deadline, the state implemented a policy of direct expropriation. The central government asserted its right of reversion, claiming that all lands and structures previously held by the minority reverted to the royal domain upon the termination of their legal status. Administrative commissions were dispatched to conduct a comprehensive inventory of all vacated buildings, ensuring that every asset was registered in the state's books. The Grand Duke utilized this massive acquisition to reward loyal members of the military nobility and to settle debts with Christian creditors by transferring titles of ownership. Communal structures and meeting halls were not destroyed, but were repurposed as secular administrative offices or granted to ecclesiastical institutions for conversion. This transfer of wealth represented a permanent structural change in the urban topography, as entire districts were integrated into the Christian municipal framework. The loss of these properties eliminated the physical basis of the community's presence, ensuring that there was no infrastructure to return to in the future. By nationalizing these fixed assets, the state effectively completed the economic dismantling of the group, converting private real estate into public and royal endowment. This systematic seizure of land and housing solidified the new social order and provided the Grand Duchy with a substantial material base for its reorganized urban administration. The administrative dismantling of the community culminated in the systematic seizure and audit of the financial archives, specifically the localized repositories containing legal debt records. These registries, which functioned as the primary documentation for the regional credit market, held the formalized bonds and promissory notes that recorded generations of private lending. Royal commissions, composed of senior treasury officials and trained legal clerks, were dispatched to every major municipality to secure these repositories and prevent the destruction or concealment of critical financial data. This process transformed the private accounts of the expelled population into the exclusive property of the central government, a procedure that effectively nationalized the outstanding debt of the entire realm. By taking physical and legal custody of these contracts, the Grand Duke bypassed the need for legislative approval to raise funds, as the state assumed the role of the primary creditor for a vast number of noble and merchant households. The comprehensive audit provided the Crown with a detailed map of the duchy's internal indebtedness, allowing the Treasury to demand immediate repayment or renegotiate interest terms for the direct benefit of the state. This transfer of ownership ensured that the expulsion did not result in a general cancellation of debts, which would have primarily benefited the landed elite at the expense of the Treasury. Instead, the monarch utilized these records to solidify his fiscal control over the nobility, using the threat of debt collection to secure political compliance during the ongoing military crisis. The meticulous recording of these assets represented a high degree of administrative sophistication, as the royal office integrated these disparate local archives into a single, centralized database of state-controlled capital. Consequently, the seizure of these records completed the economic cycle of the expulsion, ensuring that every significant financial transaction previously managed by the minority was redirected into the permanent service of the royal military and administrative machine. The physical removal of the population in the final months of 1495 involved the simultaneous movement of thousands of individuals toward the external borders of the Grand Duchy. This forced exodus was overseen by provincial bailiffs and military units who were authorized to use force to ensure that no household remained within the state's jurisdiction beyond the legal deadline. The logistics of the journey were left entirely to the displaced, who were forced to organize their own transport during a period of severe social and economic disruption. As the columns of migrants progressed through the interior, they were subjected to systematic exploitation by local officials who demanded illegal transit tolls and inspection fees at every river crossing and town gate. Private transport providers capitalized on the emergency by inflating the costs of horses and wagons, often requiring the surrender of remaining household goods as payment. The lack of royal protection for the journey meant that the travelers had no legal recourse against the predatory activities of armed bands or the arbitrary seizures conducted by regional governors. The primary migration routes led toward the western frontier, with the Kingdom of Poland and the southern territories bordering the Crimean Khanate, where the exiles sought to find temporary sanctuary. During this transition, the state maintained a continuous military presence along the main thoroughfares to prevent any unauthorized deviation from the prescribed path. The absence of organized provisioning led to high rates of physical exhaustion among the population, who were forced to travel long distances on foot. The border guards implemented rigorous identity checks, ensuring that no individual could evade the order by utilizing forged documents. These checkpoints served as the final site of asset extraction, as any items deemed of high value were often confiscated as a condition for exiting the realm. This phase of the removal completed the physical separation of the group from their homes, transforming a settled and productive urban class into a disenfranchised population in transit. By the time the migrants reached the frontier, they had been stripped of their last remaining resources by the very administrative apparatus that had once guaranteed their security. The 1495 legislation enacted the terminal dismantling of the communal infrastructure that had positioned the Grand Duchy as a major intellectual and administrative center of the northern interior. This action did not merely target individuals, but systematically liquidated the entire framework of a singular civilization that had flourished for nearly 200 years. The revocation of the collective status effectively ended the state's most significant experiment in complex governance, resulting in the immediate decay of the specialized schools and academies that had defined the urban landscape. By terminating this historical residency, the Crown permanently severed the link between the land and the professional networks that had maintained the region's technical superiority in finance and contract law. The removal of this population created an enduring void in the central civil service, which had previously relied on the literacy and organizational expertise of these subjects. This demographic shift was accompanied by the permanent loss of the documentary records that had archived the group's contributions to the material growth of the state. The reorganization of the towns that followed the exodus empowered a localized aristocracy whose political vision was restricted to the maintenance of feudal privileges. This transition represented the final abandonment of the inclusive administrative traditions that had supported the duchy's rapid rise to power. The state's focus shifted toward the enforcement of a rigid social hierarchy that excluded all forms of internal diversity, aligning the realm with the most restrictive practices of the contemporary European monarchies. The dissolution of this specialized society ensured that the regional identity was no longer defined by its ability to synthesize different social traditions, but by its absolute adherence to a single religious and political banner. Consequently, the 1495 Act achieved a permanent simplification of the body politic, concluding the existence of a unique civilization that had been integral to the state's historical foundation. The departure of the specialized financial cohort in 1495 triggered an immediate and severe contraction within the Grand Duchy's domestic credit markets. This removal eliminated the decentralized network of lenders that had previously provided the necessary liquidity for the daily operation of urban commerce. Without these intermediaries, the internal velocity of money plummeted, leading to a period of profound economic stagnation that affected all levels of the social hierarchy. Small-scale traders and artisan guilds, who had relied on short-term promissory notes to bridge the gap between production and sale, faced a systemic freeze in their activities. The sudden absence of capital hindered the procurement of raw materials and stalled the movement of goods from the rural interior to the central markets. Furthermore, the royal treasury encountered significant logistical difficulties in managing the extraction of state revenues. The direct collection of tolls and imposts by inexperienced crown officials proved to be inefficient and produced a lower yield than the previous system of leasing rights to professional agents. The landed nobility, despite their acquisition of new estates, found themselves unable to convert their agricultural surpluses into coin due to the collapse of the wholesale export networks. This credit void also resulted in the rise of irregular and unregulated lending practices among the few remaining Christian financiers who were unable to meet the total market demand for capital. The state's ambitious defensive works were intermittently suspended as the central government struggled to secure the immediate funds required for labor and material. This period of fiscal paralysis demonstrated that the administrative machinery of the realm was deeply dependent on the professional class it had just excluded. The resulting market instability underscored the critical role that decentralized credit had played in maintaining the material development of the nation during its rapid territorial expansion. The physical reconfiguration of the urban centers following the 1495 removal focused on the systematic erasure of all visible non-Christian markers from the townscape. Once the designated districts were vacant, the municipal authorities initiated a rapid process of architectural integration to merge these enclaves with the surrounding Christian neighborhoods. Religious structures, including large stone synagogues and community meeting halls, were specifically targeted for immediate repurposing to prevent them from remaining as symbols of the previous social order. Several of these buildings were transferred to the various Catholic religious orders to be consecrated as chapels or utilized as monastic dormitories. Other communal facilities were converted into secular warehouses to store state-controlled commodities like grain and timber, which supported the ongoing military efforts in the East. The city of Vilnius experienced a significant redistribution of its urban footprint, as the central government granted former minority residences to the Christian artisan guilds that had provided financial support during the succession crisis. The ritual sites and educational centers were stripped of their internal furnishings and renamed to reflect the new state identity, effectively ending the distinct public presence of the group. The municipal councils also reorganized the street layouts, removing the physical gates and barriers that had previously demarcated the autonomous quarters. This integration ensured that the town's policing and tax collection were managed under a single, unified administrative framework. The cemeteries and other suburban land holdings were frequently reclaimed by the Crown and designated as public grazing lands or sites for new defensive fortifications. By altering the visual and functional character of these districts, the administration signaled that the social transformation of the realm was irreversible. This rebranding of the urban environment served to reinforce the narrative of a unified religious nation, while providing the Christian burghers with the material spoils of the expulsion. The rapid transition from specialized communal spaces to standardized state infrastructure completed the physical integration of the cities into the Catholic realm.